Jerry Winrob, the big guy, didn't want me for this. I wouldn't even get a reading from him. He was insistent each time my name was mentioned during the casting submission process. He states, "This is a heavyweight role, so I don't want a comedian or a comic actor for it. I want an actor." He was the silent teacher whose insight molded a generation and the beating heart of the Karate Kid. However, Pat Morita's trip was anything but peaceful behind the scenes. The man who made Mr. Miyagi come to life finally spoke up before he died, sharing the truth about what actually happened on set. It was more than just crane postures, kicks, and lines. It was about wars that were never captured on camera. For all those years, what truth did he bear? And why didn't he disclose it till the very end? Miyagi was facing the wall. Mr. Miyagi, the quiet handyman with a wise gaze, clipped words, and a gentle strength that saw Daniel LaRusso through his most trying times, is the first person that comes to mind when people think of the Karate Kid. However, the majority of fans were unaware that the man who became Miyagi hardly ever had the opportunity until Pat Morita himself spoke out years later. Actually, one of Hollywood's most influential voices at the time was working to prevent him from playing the part at all. For the most part, Pat Morita had been a comic. He was known by audiences for his humorous television appearances, his ability to deliver humor with seamless timing, and his rapid on-liners. Because of his record, he was seen by many executives as the last person who could represent a mentor who was emotionally damaged and war-hardened. When Miyagi first appeared during casting meetings, producer Jerry Winrob slapped away Morita's name as it floated into the room. According to reports, Winrob, a prominent figure in the industry, yelled that he didn't want a comic near this section. He desired a heavyweight, gravitas, who could convince viewers that he was a guy who silently bore both tragedy and knowledge. The wall was that, and that wall remained solid for weeks. Each time Winrob saw Morita's name on a list, he rejected it. He believed there were plenty of actors in America who would be more suitable for the role. Casting directors and producers sought somewhere else, looking at headshots and bringing in performers who sounded and looked like the character, or at least had the background Winrob desired. Not even given a chance to read Pat Morita. But this is where everything started to go wrong. Having already shown his ability to spot underdog stories with Rocky director John Avildsen had no intention of going down the same old route. He saw that more than just fighting and training montages were necessary for the Karate Kid to succeed. It necessitated a genuine human connection between mentor and pupil. Additionally, he wanted to look everywhere. Regardless of whether Winrob approved or not, Avildsen insisted that all potential candidates be read. Later, Pat Morita would think about how strange that was. He was practically an afterthought, the last performer brought in when his turn came. He was also aware of the irony. Because the director persisted, the actor who had been so flatly rejected by the producer was now being viewed. For an actor whose career had been limited to years of alternating between stand-up performances and tiny TV roles, that was the moment. This was not merely an audition. It was an unanticipated opportunity at a role that everyone else seemed determined to deny him. One day after rapping, rejection might subtly open a door the next day, proving to Morita how erratic Hollywood could be. Back when Miyagi was so popular, people might have forgotten that there had once been a period of time during casting discussions when there was a noticeable sense of tension. But Morita would always remember it. Later in life, he publicly discussed the near-death experience Winrob's camp had with the project before it had even begun. Morita attributed the transformation of his entire career to John Avildsen's very persistence. More than simply another behind-the-scenes conflict is revealed by this. It demonstrates how brittle the process of creating movie legends can be. One executive's disdain, one producer's fleeting judgment. It was that one moment that changed everything. Morita might not have gone inside the audition room if Avalon hadn't been firm. Furthermore, the Karate Kid would not be the same tale that we all knew without Morita. In his artistic pursuits, the wall he eventually encountered would prove to be intractable. As Pat would sardonically argue over the years, walls should be scaled or cut through. Shortly afterward, he found himself on a completely different stage, yet not a single person in the audience could even remotely connect with the polished clown they had seen. Because it wasn't the polished comic from TV who entered that audition room. He was a weary, bearded man who had just arrived from Hawaii. He could hardly recognize the person in the mirror. Hawaii's fate and beard. Pat Morita's career was veering into uncharted territory during the early 1980s. From comedies like Happy Days to stand-up clubs, he had already had the taste of stardom. But the offers had slowed and the limelight seemed to be evaporating. He ended himself in Hawaii, making a livelihood from whatever job came his way, rather than pursuing roles in Hollywood. Performing in nightclubs, writing content for advertisements, and emceeing political fundraisers. Although it wasn't stable or flashy, it was enough to pay the expenses. From the outside, Morita's career appeared to be slowly waning. He felt as though he was waiting for something invisible, treading water. Then he made a choice that fundamentally altered his reputation. He allowed his beard and hair to grow out for the first time in his life. Nor for a part, nor for a performance, just because he wanted to try something new. He looked more like a hippie than an actor, Pat later remarked with laughter. He didn't care at the time, though. He wasn't concerned about looking camera-ready or pursuing casting directors. He was just living, allowing his appearance to be a reflection of the less polished, more uncertain chapter he was in. That unkempt beard, which was out of the ordinary for him, would turn out to be a lucky break. Unbeknownst to him at the time, that appearance contributed to giving the impression that he was a tough guy who had experienced adversity when he eventually got the chance to try out for The Karate Kid. Compared to the comedian audiences were accustomed to seeing, it gave him an older, wiser, and more grounded appearance. What began as a personal decision quickly turned into an unforeseen gift for his career. Pat had long come to terms with the fact that his life had become about silence. Actually, he considered letting his agent's contract expire when it came up. However, he changed his mind and was giving his agency a rather grudging reappointment. What on earth? So one afternoon, certain that there were no opportunities waiting for him, he left his agent's office and prepared to head back to Hawaii. At this point, fate stepped in with a booming yell. From above, a booming voice had roared, "Pat Morita." Shouting that he had just left the office, the secretary rushed out. The agent leaned out and gave him a frantic wave in return. "Get your ass back in here, Pat. I believe there is a script that would be ideal for you." The Karate Kid was the script. It's the sort of tale that Hollywood appears to find too tidy. A movie about destiny should be written. It was more of a strange moment, as Morita subsequently recalled. Standing there with one foot out, he accepted that nothing awaited him here and waited to leave Los Angeles. Then the script fell on him almost like a last-minute interception. He perused it. It pleased him. He consented to try out for John Abson. It didn't feel like a life-altering event at that moment, it was just another room, another director, or a chance. However, the beard, the timing, and the serendipitous event of being escorted back through the door all started to give way to a larger plan. In retrospect, when Morita discussed this occurrence, he did so with awe, considering that maybe an unseen hand had guided him back toward his intended path. He wouldn't have resembled Miyagi if he hadn't been in Hawaii. There wouldn't have been a script for anyone to show him if he hadn't quit with his agent. He may have been overlooked by luck if he hadn't shuffled his feet on the sidewalk that day. The culmination of all those small choices, mishaps, and detours led to an opportunity to try out for a part the producers had never wanted him to read for. Furthermore, he did not find a panel of judges or a table of executives when he eventually entered the audition area. One man wearing a camera strap was observing him via the lens, Assan's test with a single camera. Pat Morita anticipated the typical Hollywood setup when he was given the opportunity to read for The Karate Kid. Every word he says will be scrutinized by a producer taking notes, a casting assistant, and possibly a writer in the corner. Rather, he entered a practically deserted room and immediately entered one of the most peculiar auditions of his career. John Avildsen, the director who had already made his mark on movie history with Rocky, was seated there. But Avildsen wasn't flipping through a script or lounging behind a desk. He was part machine and half man. He held a camera on one side of himself. In contrast, he wore the heavy battery pack strapped to his chest. Despite his cordial introduction, he never lowered the camera. Morita was being filmed as soon as he intervened. Morita would later quip that he initially thought of Avildsen as a half-director, half-recording device. But there was a serious lesson hidden beneath the fun. Avildsen was looking for more than a well-written text. When no one else thought Pat could be Miyagi, he wanted to record the man's unadulterated presence to see if he could. Avildsen, still looking through the glass, added, "Tell me a little about yourself." Pat then talked about his life, profession, and highs and lows rather than reciting prepared phrases. He wasn't auditioning in the conventional sense at the time. He was providing a glimpse of his true self. Avildsen continued to roll. The script then appeared. Pat had no intention of reciting a few safe lines for the most difficult scenes that hadn't been produced, choreographed, or anything else yet. Without sets, costumes, or another actor to play off, he improvised and leaned into the emotional weight of his role as Miyagi. He only anticipated a courteous thank you and dismissal when he was done. This one sentence was electrifying. "Pat, don't you want to take your script with you? You might need it," Avildsen yelled as he began to leave. For the first time, Morita felt as though he had finally pierced the barrier of uncertainty that surrounded him. He had entered as a bearded comic. Despite all the obstacles, he went out as someone who could have become Mr. Miyagi. It was already decided by Avildsen. He would play that footage again later in meetings when the producers were debating potential casting decisions. He once simply clicked on the monitor during a heated argument while they were in production. When Morita's audition popped up on the screen, the meeting became silent. The tape did confirm that Morita could act. It confirmed that he was Miyagi in a way that no one else was. Then Winrob, the same person who had refused to even consider him, said, "Hey, wait a minute. That looks like Miyagi." Avildsen turned calmly and said, "That's the Pat Morita you refused to read for the part." Hollywood, of all, is not one to give anything up without a fight. And even although Avildsen's recording proved outstanding, Morita was called back repeatedly because they were producers and needed to be sure. It was the crack that began to weaken the wall of opposition. The doubt gradually subsided, but it all began with that one camera test in which Pat Morita faced the watchful eyes of a director who believed in capturing the truth on film, rather than a panel of skeptics. In the future, the tests would not only be about him. Could he repeat the performance? Could he do it in costume? Would he be able to hold his own beside Ralph Macchio? Morita delivered again. To see if a genuine connection could form between a student and a teacher, they would pair him with a young actor from New York. 5 tests, 1 chemistry. While most actors can land a role with a strong audition, Pat Morita needed 5. The producers wanted more even after John Avildsen's tape convinced doubters. The first 2 tests were straightforward reenactments. Could Pat Morita replicate the same intensity and subtlety from his first audition? Could he tap into the quiet authority of Miyagi without slipping into humor or parody? Each time Morita delivered, they went through a torturous series of tests, 5 separate sessions designed to prove whether Pat Morita could not only act the part, but live it. In the 3rd test, with Ralph Macchio flying in from New York, the producers wanted to know if the chemistry between Daniel LaRusso and Mr. Miyagi felt genuine. He spoke with weight, carried himself with dignity, and displayed moments of vulnerability that suggested Miyagi's deeper story. The script demanded a relationship that went beyond teacher and student to include father and son, mentor and guide. Morita and Macchio's relationship was not even the source of the infused serious gravitas. If they didn't click, the entire movie would fall apart. At first, they would read together, just simple dialogue, then into dramatic materials. The wax-on, wax-off moments, full soul-bearing confessions, and empty silences that scream louder than words. He listened, he reacted, he guided, and slowly, Mikio leaned into him as if he were someone he could trust. That would be the first sign of a partnership to anchor the entire franchise. The producers could see it, but they needed more before committing. Instead, it was his warm, naturally flowing response. The fourth test added costumes. Would Morita be able to look like it? In a very basic GE, with his hair and beard serving as features, he was transformed from a nightclub comic or sitcom regular to a man shaped by age, experience, and silent pain. Ralph later acknowledged that the change was shocking when Pat dressed as Miyagi, as if he became character. The clincher was the fifth and final test, which required a reading on a chilly, empty soundstage with just Morita, Mikio, and the camera. No sets, no props, because studio chiefs ultimately wanted guarantees beyond guarantees. When the camera stopped, the silence was deafening. The answer came quickly. The two interacted as if it were second nature. Makio did not deliver lines. He was responding to a mentor who seemed very real. Morita did not act. He inhabited Miyagi. Not only had 5 auditions demonstrated his acting abilities, but they also demonstrated that he was Miyagi in a way that no one else could match. It had been a difficult but enduring experience, and after that, Ralph Macchio and Pat Morita were no longer co-stars. Instead, they became Daniel and Miyagi, bound together by a chemistry that spanned generations. Morita's identity as Miyagi was confirmed by 5 perfect tests, but it was one phone call from the most frank skeptic that sealed his doom. Although Pat Morita eventually passed the rigorous audition, screen test, and chemistry read process, there was still one shadow that remained: Jerry Winenrob, the formidable producer who had been the barrier that almost prevented Morita from appearing in The Karate Kid. Morita's future had been on the brink of Winrob's uncertainty for weeks until the phone call that turned everything upside down. He didn't want a comedian in the position, and he didn't believe Pat could carry the gravity and weight of a mentor figure. It was a quiet exchange, with Miyagi speaking to Daniel in that clipped, halting rhythm Pat had shaped out of instinct and exhaustion. And Daniel's response was not that of an actor reading lines, but rather that of a boy leaning into the wisdom of someone who seemed to care. It took place after the 5th test, when Morita and Ralph Macchio in costume performed in front of the studio heads. Absin, as assured as ever, let the camera roll, and the stillness of it carried more weight than any action sequence ever could. Absin had been Morita's champion from the start, fighting for his inclusion, keeping his tape in circulation, and playing the footage whenever Winrob became contemptuous. Now, in front of a full room, Morita and Chio were unquestionable. When the exam was over, there was quiet, a hush so thick it could tip the scales instead of laughter or doubt. Winrob didn't spare words when he picked up the phone and saw Morita waiting at home. Still uncertain if the character he had thrown himself into would disappear, he said, "I almost made the worst mistake of my life. I just want to be the first to congratulate you. You've got the part of Miyagi." His normally piercing and uncompromising voice now carried a different weight. Morita had wanted that job for personal redemption, declaring to the world in complete defiance. Not a comedian, not Morita. As Pat would say, he felt both triumph and humility at the same time. He had not bragged, he had not raised his voice, he had not pointed out how close they had come to excluding him. But in one phone call, the entire balance of power in the production changed, and the room that had once looked down on him was now standing up in respect. Although it was somewhat of a turning point for Morita, it was more of that for the movie. And he had just taken the part with an inner sense of pride, knowing that this triumph meant so much more than just his own career. Miyagi was much more than a character, he was destined to be a cultural icon. Production was tied up with the co-casting of Miyagi. Ralph Macchio had John Abdulson as his mentor by heart, and Jerry Winrob had the courage to own up to his mistakes. Pat's victory was even sweeter because he had to work hard to get the part and overcome a lot of doubt. With Winrob's words still echoing in his ears, Pat Morita's fight was far from over. Once the cameras began rolling, he had to convince viewers that Miyagi's broken English was poetry rather than comedy. This was the first time he could put himself in Miyagai's shoes with all the strength his worth could muster. How Miyagai's voice came to be: one triumph was landing the part of Mr. Miyagi, another was giving Miyagi a voice that would live on in the memory of the world. Pat Morita understood that Miyagai's speech could make or break the character. If it veered too far into caricature, it ran the risk of becoming a cliché. Morita had to strike a balance between dignity and authenticity because, as Hollywood frequently did with Asian characters, if it were too smooth and polished, it wouldn't fit the script's vision of an immigrant janitor and war veteran rooted in broken rhythms of English learned late in life. That's why Miyagi talks like this, Morita later explained with a wry smile, because it wasn't planned. Ironically, the first spark was exhaustion. During his early auditions, Morita was worn out from the lengthy process of proving himself. His energy ran low, and his words slowed, dropping into clipped, halting phrases. When he lacked the strength to overthink, it was just what came out. However, it caught the attention of Avalon and others. It wasn't a clownish cadence. It wasn't coerced. It was heavy. It seemed authentic to Miyagi's past. Morita worked it out, though. He embraced the notion of a man who spoke slowly and purposefully, who had studied English as a second language, but who gave each word careful attention. The poor grammar was transformed into a form of poetry rather than a flaw. Anything is possible for a man who uses chopsticks to catch flies, Miyagi says Daniel. And it lands as a bit of ancient wisdom rather than as a joke. People leaned in and listened more intently because of the rhythm, which seemed to have meaning in each pause. According to Ralph Macchio, the voice initially disarmed him. He was aware that Morita was a quick-witted comedian. All of a sudden, though, the contrast was magical. He was up against someone else. Words fall into the river like little stones, and the silence is almost meditative. Daniel stumbled over his statements and was brimming with tense energy. Miyagi, on the other hand, subdued the atmosphere around him by speaking in simple, broken English. There was a wonderful balance between the two rhythms. Naturally, there were still some concerned people in the studio. Was this excessive? Would viewers be amused in the wrong ways? He has his own concerns, Morita. He was aware that accents have historically been used to denigrate rather than to elevate in Hollywood. However, he believed that Miyagi would transcend caricature if he gave it honor and spoke from the heart rather than through parody. And he was right. Instead of serving as a joke, Miyagi's speech became a component of his charm, humor, and compassion. Away from the halting, stilted Miyagi speech, it enjoyed a smooth, even song-like continuum, disenfranchised above his voice organically like off-screen. When this disparity was revealed about him in later interviews, many admirers were shocked. They found it hard to believe. With such a halting, broken staccato, the polished, clever man who was telling them stories and experiences must have been the same one who said, "Wax on, wax off." But there was the artistry of Morita. He made a mask, a performance that was so convincing that it was taken as fact. The accent grew smaller than that voice. It developed into a character unto itself. Children made impacts. The adults recalled it. The comedians made fun of it. However, some of that cultural echo maintained the seriousness at all times. Morita had created a figure that was simultaneously dignified, humorous, and sorrowful. Despite his meticulous efforts to mold Miyagi's voice, Morita would still have to deal with a more profound irony. He was also stuck in ways he would never be able to fully get out of the role that salvaged his career. He never forgot such moments. The Karate Kid was more than simply a film to Pat Morita. After years of hardship, it was a pivotal moment, a second chance at life. Morita personally carried softer recollections from the set, while the rest of the world recalls the crane kick, the waxen lessons, and Miyagi's calm wisdom, moments that shaped his relationship with the group and his development as a person. He would never forget these events. The night shoot for the famous drunk Miyagi scene was one of them. The studio wasn't sure if it should be included. Executives questioned whether viewers would put up with the sage mentor's vulnerability as he recalled losing his wife and child in an internment camp. Morita, however, battled for it. He gave the scene his all, stumbling through Miyagai's grief with a rawness that left the crew speechless. No one applauded when the camera stopped, Ralph Macchio subsequently recalled. Nobody said anything. They simply allowed Morita to remain silent. That evening proved to Pat that he was capable of more than just comedy. He had the power to bring people to tears. The capturing the fly with chopsticks gag was a smaller, less staged scene that evoked another recollection. Although the moment was intended to be lighthearted, Morita gave it a deeper meaning. His hands were steady, his eyes fixed on the impossible task, and he played it with an almost childish focus. Instead, when Daniel is successful, their chemistry explodes into real laughing. That small scene was so important to Morita that she loved it. Miyagi was more than just an educator. He was a man capable of surprise, competition, and laughter. For Morita, the friendship with Ralph Macchio was undoubtedly another treasured experience. When they were filming, Ralph was still a teenager, juggling the demands of celebrity and pressure. While Morita, who was considerably older, also had to play the role of offset protector. Both off-camera and on-camera, he imparted life lessons to Ralph through gentle humor and life experience. Their relationship would eventually be referred to by Macchio as the heart of the film, both on and off-screen. That love wasn't predetermined for Morita. Every day they performed together, it became more authentic. He also remembers how, over time, the crew's cynicism waned. Several of them had formally questioned if the Happy Days comedian could perform the part. But Morita could notice a shift as the days passed. Even the stunt crew treated him with the kind of deference that only distinguished individuals receive by the time the tournament scenes were being recorded. He wasn't merely a performer portraying a sensei. In fact, he had become one of them. He carried that respect with him long after the filming was over. The goal of this tiny ritual, like all the others Morita developed in between takes, was to blend in with Miyagai's voice, not for the camera. In this way, he kept himself grounded. Occasionally, he'd improvisedly provide a crew advice in bad English, half in his own rhythm. Joking that Miyagi was teaching them valuable lessons in a scene change, they began to pursue him. Morita treasured it because it demonstrated that Miyagi was more than just words. To everyone who approached him, he appeared alive. In retrospect, Morita would see that the film's spirit was derived from all of the silence, laughter, and chemistry. He knew that much. He cared about the bonds formed in the quiet corners of the set, the proof that something real had taken root behind the Hollywood machinery, even though the crane kick would always be there. And as Pat Morita recalled these events near the end of his life, it became evident that Mr. Miyagi was more than simply a character. It was a genuine gift that genuinely influenced him just as much as he did. Pat acknowledged in a final thought that The Karate Kid had given him an opportunity that no other movie had ever given him, the opportunity to be known as an artist who put his heart into a character that had an impact on the world, rather than as a comic who got lucky. Tap like if Pat Morita's own comments altered your perception of The Karate Kid. For more untold set stories, subscribe and share your favorite Miyagi moment in the comments below. Watch the next video on your screen when you're ready to learn another behind-the-scenes fact that actors didn't disclose until years later.